Ardennes Forest, Belgium. December 24th, 1944. The cold arrived before Christmas. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow certainty of something that intended to stay. It crept into boots and gloves, into rifles and breath, into wounds that refused to close. By Christmas Eve, the Ardennes were locked in ice. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Celsius, in places. In some valleys, it fell lower. Snow lay thick beneath the dense pine canopy, muffling sound, swallowing footprints, hiding bodies where they fell. Fog clung to the forest like a second skin, blinding patrols and confusing maps. Roads disappeared. Landmarks vanished. Entire units lost their sense of direction. And somewhere in that frozen forest, tens of thousands of men were waiting for Christmas. Most of them did not believe they would survive it. Just 8 days earlier, on December 16, 1944, the war had changed its rhythm. At 05:30 in the morning, under the cover of heavy fog and snow, German artillery opened fire across a 135-kilometer front, stretching through the Ardennes of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. The Allies had not expected it. They believed the German army was broken, retreating, incapable of large-scale operations. They were wrong. The attack, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, hit some of the most inexperienced and exhausted American divisions in Europe. Many units were under strength. Some were resting. Others were holding what had been considered a quiet sector, chosen precisely because it seemed unlikely to see major action. By nightfall on December 16th, entire American regiments were cut off. Communication lines collapsed. Fuel depots were captured. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles and refugees. The front line ceased to exist in any coherent sense. The war folded inward, into forests, villages, barns, cellars, into places never meant for battles. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the Ardennes had become a trap. American soldiers found themselves surrounded in small pockets, often without knowing it. German units advanced through wooded terrain, bypassing strong points, leaving isolated enemy positions behind. Maps were outdated almost immediately. Radios failed in the cold. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Men learned where the front was by listening, by the sound of engines, by accents shouted in the dark, by the crack of rifles from directions that should have been friendly. The forest erased certainty. Snow softened the sound of movement. A patrol could pass within meters and never be seen. At night, flares illuminated scenes that seemed unreal. Trees glowing white, figures frozen mid-motion, shadows stretched impossibly long across the snow. And always, the cold. Rifles jammed as lubricants froze. Metal burned bare skin on contact. Frostbite took fingers, toes, noses. Wounded men bled less, not because their injuries were minor, but because the cold slowed everything, including death. Sometimes, it slowed it too much. Medics described men who remained conscious for hours after wounds that should have killed them, only to die quietly when the body finally surrendered. Others froze in place, still holding weapons, eyes open. Christmas was coming. On December 24th, Allied command finally understood the scale of the crisis. General Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized emergency countermeasures. Air support was planned, but grounded by weather. Supplies were promised, but delayed. Relief columns struggled along icy roads under constant threat of ambush. In some units, soldiers received word that hot food and winter clothing were on the way. In others, no one came. Inside the forest, Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony. There were no trees, no decorations, no songs. There were frozen foxholes scraped into snow-covered ground, barns already packed with wounded, and villages reduced to tactical positions. A house was no longer a home. It was cover, or a firing point, or a place to die. Some men marked the night anyway. A few shared cigarettes, saved for weeks. Others opened rations meant to last days. Chaplains moved through the lines where possible, offering short prayers that were often cut off by shell fire. In some places, soldiers whispered carols, not because they believed in comfort, but because the words connected them to something that existed before the forest closed around them. Most did not bother. Christmas felt irrelevant here, dangerous even. It reminded men of warmth, of safety, of families who believed they were somewhere dry and protected. It sharpened the distance between memory and reality. Outside, artillery thundered. In the Ardennes, the enemy was not just human. The forest itself became a weapon. Snow concealed tripwires and mines. Trees shattered under shelling, sending wooden splinters through bodies with the force of shrapnel. Paths that looked solid collapsed into drifts waist-deep. Vehicles slid into ditches and froze there, abandoned. Evacuation of wounded was often impossible. Stretcher teams struggled through snow for hours, only to be turned back by shell fire or blocked roads. Men bled out waiting. Others froze while still alive, morphine long gone, pain dulled only by hypothermia. The dead could not always be buried. Frozen ground resisted shovels. Graves took hours to dig, if they could be dug at all. Many bodies were left where they fell, covered with snow that acted like a temporary shroud. Some units marked locations with helmets on sticks. Others had no time. The snow kept their secrets. German soldiers suffered no less. Contrary to popular myth, many German units in the Ardennes were also under-equipped for extreme winter conditions. Fuel shortages plagued their advance. Orders demanded speed that terrain and weather refused to allow. Casualties mounted quickly. Christmas Eve found German infantrymen sleeping in ditches, barns, and shell holes, often within a few hundred meters of American positions, unaware of each other's exact location. In rare moments, men from both sides could hear each other coughing in the dark. No one spoke. There would be no truce in the Ardennes. Not this time. In the village of Bastogne, surrounded American forces held out under constant bombardment. Elsewhere, smaller pockets endured similar isolation, without the recognition Bastogne would later receive. Entire platoons disappeared into the forest, never formally overrun, never formally withdrawn, simply erased. By Christmas Eve, Allied casualties had reached into the tens of thousands. German losses were comparable. The front bulged outward, warped by momentum and resistance, creating the shape that would give the battle its name. But inside the forest, names did not matter. What mattered was warmth, ammunition, food, direction, and none of those were guaranteed. As midnight approached on December 24, 1944, snow continued to fall. Men pulled coats tighter around themselves, knowing it would not be enough. Rifles were cradled like fragile things. Fingers were tucked into armpits, then returned to triggers that burned like ice. Somewhere, church bells rang in villages far behind the lines. In the Ardennes, there was only the forest breathing, slow, heavy, indifferent. Christmas had arrived, and in that frozen silence, surrounded by enemies they could not see, many soldiers understood something with sudden clarity. They were not waiting for Christmas to end. They were waiting to see if they would still be alive when it did. In early December 1944, the Ardennes were considered a place to rest. For the Allied command, this dense, forested region stretching across eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg was a backwater. Rough terrain, narrow roads, poor visibility, and little strategic value for a defeated enemy. The German army, battered by months of retreat after Normandy, was assumed to be incapable of mounting any large-scale operation. Intelligence reports spoke of shortages: fuel, aircraft, trained manpower. The Western Front, many believed, was entering its final phase. So the Ardennes were given to units that needed time. American divisions rotated into the sector to recover from heavy fighting elsewhere. Some were newly arrived in Europe, lacking combat experience. Others were exhausted veterans, grateful for what seemed like a quiet assignment. Defensive lines were thin. Artillery was spread out. Minefields were incomplete. Patrols were routine. The forest was not expected to fight back. But while the Allies rested, Germany prepared. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was planning one last gamble. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly in the east. Allied forces were pushing through France and into Western Germany. German cities were being destroyed from the air. Fuel reserves were critically low. Morale was brittle. Hitler refused to accept defeat. Instead, he envisioned a decisive counteroffensive in the West. One that would split the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force Britain and the United States into a negotiated peace. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy, but desperation gave it momentum. The Ardennes were chosen precisely because they were considered unlikely. German forces would attack through terrain the Allies believed impassable in winter. They would move under cover of fog and snow, neutralizing Allied air superiority. Speed would compensate for shortages. Surprise would do the rest. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Few outside Hitler's inner circle believed it could succeed, but belief was no longer the point. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the forest erupted. At 05:30, more than 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire along a broad front. The bombardment was short, but intense, designed to shock rather than destroy. Shells slammed into American positions, shattering the quiet of the winter morning. Communications were severed, command posts were hit, roads were cratered. Then, the infantry moved. German units advanced through fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere meters. Snow muffled footsteps. Tanks crept along forest roads, engines throttled low. Assault groups bypassed strong points, leaving isolated American units behind to be dealt with later. The effect was devastating. American soldiers awoke to chaos. Some were still sleeping in barracks, barns, or village houses when the shelling began. Others rushed to defensive positions that no longer existed as mapped. Orders contradicted each other. Radios crackled and died. Officers struggled to understand what was happening, let alone respond to it. Within hours, the front was unrecognizable. The U.S. 106th Infantry Division, holding positions near the Schnee Eifel, bore the brunt of the initial assault. Inexperienced and spread thin, two of its regiments were quickly surrounded. Cut off from support, short on ammunition, and under constant attack, they attempted to withdraw through snow-covered forest paths, already controlled by German forces. They never made it. By December 19th, nearly 7,000 American soldiers from the 106th Division had been captured, the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. Many were marched east through snow and ice, inadequately clothed, some dying before reaching prison camps. Elsewhere, similar scenes unfolded. German armored spearheads punched through road junctions, seizing fuel dumps and supply depots. Vehicles abandoned by retreating American units were pressed into German service. Signs were changed. Road markers were turned around. The landscape itself became a weapon of confusion. American units found themselves attacked from directions that made no sense. The forest swallowed orientation. The weather was the Germans' greatest ally. Low clouds, fog, and snow grounded Allied aircraft for days. Fighter bombers that normally dominated the battlefield were useless. Reconnaissance flights were impossible. German columns moved largely unseen, their presence discovered only when they struck. For American commanders, the situation was nightmarish. Reports conflicted wildly. Some units claimed massive enemy formations. Others insisted the attacks were local probes. Headquarters struggled to determine where the main thrust was aimed. Antwerp, Liège, Bastogne? No one could say with certainty. What was clear was that the Germans were advancing faster than expected. By December 18th, panic began to spread. Roads filled with retreating soldiers, supply vehicles, refugees, and wounded men. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers. Orders to hold positions clashed with the reality of being flanked and encircled. Some commanders chose to withdraw, rather than risk annihilation. Others held fast, unaware they were already surrounded. In the confusion, acts of heroism and collapse existed side by side. Small units fought stubbornly from villages and crossroads, delaying German advances at terrible cost. Others dissolved under pressure, their cohesion shattered by fear, exhaustion, and cold. The Ardennes were no longer quiet. As the German advance deepened, its momentum began to strain. Fuel shortages quickly became critical. German planners had assumed they could capture Allied fuel depots intact. In some cases, they did. In many others, supplies had been destroyed or were insufficient. Tanks ran dry on forest roads. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of gasoline. The weather that hid the Germans also slowed them. Snow-choked roads and narrow mountain passes caused bottlenecks. Heavy armor struggled to maneuver. Engineers worked constantly to clear paths, repair bridges, and extract vehicles stuck in drifts. Time, Germany's most precious commodity, was being lost with every kilometer. But for the men fighting in the forest, strategic calculations were irrelevant. What they experienced was shock. They had believed the war was nearly over, that Germany was finished, that Christmas would be spent in relative safety, perhaps even with hot meals and mail from home. Instead, Christmas was approaching in a frozen forest filled with enemies. By December 20th, the outline of the battle had become clearer. The German offensive had created a deep bulge in the Allied lines, stretching westward into Belgium. Bastogne, a vital road junction, was surrounded but not taken. American airborne units rushed in to hold it. Other towns, Saint-Vith, Houffalize, Clairvaux, became focal points of bitter fighting. The forest echoed with gunfire day and night. Temperatures plunged further. Snowfall intensified. Wounded men froze waiting for evacuation. Frostbite claimed fingers and feet. Sleep became nearly impossible, snatched in minutes between alarms and shelling. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Soldiers spoke less. Jokes disappeared. Letters went unwritten. Survival narrowed to immediate needs: warmth, ammunition, food, direction. Christmas was now only days away. On December 23rd, the weather finally began to clear. Blue sky appeared above the Ardennes for the first time since the offensive began. Almost immediately, Allied aircraft filled the air. Fighter bombers struck German columns, supply lines, and artillery positions. The forest that had concealed the attackers now exposed them. The balance began to shift. But the cost had already been set. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, tens of thousands of men on both sides were dead, wounded, missing, or captured. Entire units had been shattered. Villages lay in ruins. The Ardennes, once dismissed as a quiet sector, had become one of the bloodiest battlefields of the war. And for the soldiers still trapped within the forest, there was no sense of relief, only exhaustion. Christmas was coming, and in the Ardennes, it would be measured not in hours of celebration, but in how long a man could endure the cold, the fear, and the silence before the next shot rang out. The Ardennes did not roar like other battlefields. It did not announce danger with open plains or obvious front lines. It absorbed sound, distorted distance, erased certainty. In winter, it became something else entirely, an environment that killed without needing to fire a shot. By December 20th, 1944, the forest had already claimed thousands of lives not through bullets or artillery, but through exposure, exhaustion, and disorientation. Snow lay deep beneath the towering pines. In some areas, drifts reached waist height. Narrow roads twisted through hills and valleys, often reduced to single icy tracks, barely wide enough for vehicles to pass. At night, Temperatures dropped relentlessly. Soldiers recorded 20 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Celsius, as common, with wind chill driving the effective temperature much lower. Clothing froze stiff, blankets iced over, breath crystallized on beards and collars. Sweat from exertion turned deadly when men stopped moving. The forest punished stillness. American infantrymen learned quickly that stopping meant freezing. Foxholes scraped into frozen ground offered little protection. Digging was exhausting, often impossible. Picks and shovels bounced uselessly off iron-hard soil. Some men resorted to blasting shallow holes with grenades, then lining them with branches and stolen doors to keep snow from collapsing inward. Even then, sleep was dangerous. Men who fell asleep too deeply sometimes never woke. Hypothermia crept in quietly, numbing limbs, slowing thought, persuading the body that rest was safe. Comrades learned to wake each other every few minutes, to shake shoulders, to check for shivering, because when shivering stopped, death was near. The wounded were especially vulnerable. A man hit in summer might survive hours or days awaiting evacuation. In the Ardennes winter, minutes mattered. Blood loss combined with cold accelerated shock. Morphine dulled pain, but masked worsening hypothermia. Many wounded men begged not to be left alone, knowing what isolation meant. Medics did what they could. They wrapped bodies in blankets, shared their own coats, pressed skin against skin to transfer warmth. But supplies were limited, and evacuation routes were often cut. Stretcher bearers struggled through snow and shellfire, slipping on ice, collapsing from exhaustion. Some froze alongside the men they were trying to save. In official reports, many deaths were later listed simply as exposure. That word concealed everything. The forest also dismantled orientation. Snow erased landmarks. Fog turned distances elastic. Sound traveled unpredictably. Rifle fire echoed in strange directions. Artillery rumbled like distant thunder, without clear origin. Soldiers became unsure whether shots were friendly or hostile until it was too late. Units became fragments. Platoons lost companies. Companies lost battalions. Orders arrived garbled, or not at all. Maps were useless within days. Roads blocked by wrecked vehicles and fallen trees. Men navigated by memory, by instinct, by luck. Many walked directly into enemy positions. German units exploited this confusion skillfully. Small assault groups infiltrated through woods, bypassing strong points and attacking supply lines. They moved silently, using white camouflage to blend into snow. At night, they listened, just as Americans did, for coughing, for metal scraping, for the low murmur of voices. The forest turned everyone into prey. German soldiers suffered no less from the cold. Despite popular belief, many German units were ill-prepared for a prolonged winter campaign. Fuel shortages limited heating and mobility. Some soldiers wore thin greatcoats unsuited for the extreme cold. Frostbite casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. The difference lay in doctrine. German commanders emphasized movement and infiltration. Units were encouraged to keep advancing, to avoid prolonged static positions that invited cold and artillery alike. This sometimes preserved momentum, but it also exhausted men already running on minimal rations. Food became a problem quickly. Supply columns lagged behind advancing spearheads. What was captured from American depots was often consumed immediately. Hot meals were rare. Soldiers ate frozen bread, hard rations, whatever could be scavenged from abandoned villages. Hunger compounded weakness. The forest inflicted psychological damage as effectively as physical harm. Isolation became constant. Soldiers spent hours, sometimes days, without seeing friendly faces beyond their immediate group. Darkness fell early, stretching nights into endless watches punctuated by sudden terror. Sleep came in fragments, broken by cold, alarms, and shellfire. Fear did not arrive in bursts. It seeped. Men feared freezing, feared being wounded, feared capture, feared being mistaken for the enemy, feared the silence, because silence often meant something was moving unseen. Some soldiers later described the Ardennes as the first time they felt hunted. Christmas Eve arrived with no sense of transition. There were no decorations, no markers beyond the calendar in a man's memory. Snow continued to fall. Artillery continued to fire. Men continued to die. In scattered positions across the forest, soldiers attempted gestures of normality. A chaplain held a brief service inside a shattered barn, his voice shaking more from cold than emotion. In another sector, a lieutenant passed around a bottle saved for the occasion, each man taking a single sip. Someone hummed a carol before stopping abruptly, embarrassed by the sound. Most did nothing at all. Christmas felt inappropriate here, almost dangerous. It made men think of warmth, of families gathered indoors, of food that did not taste of tin and ice. It widened the gulf between where they were and where they belonged. The forest offered no comfort. On December 24, 25, casualties continued to mount. Some men died in firefights that lasted minutes. Others died alone, lost in the woods, unable to find their units. Patrols occasionally stumbled upon bodies frozen in seated positions, weapons still resting across knees, expressions peaceful or blank. Many would not be found until spring. Snow buried them gently, preserving them as the forest had taken them. In some cases, soldiers froze so quickly that wounds never bled properly. Autopsies later revealed injuries that should have been survivable. Cold had finished what bullets began. Commanders struggled to account for losses. Reports listed men as missing who were dead meters from friendly lines. Others were counted alive, long after they had frozen. The forest disrupted not just combat, but memory. The psychological strain reached breaking points. Cases of combat fatigue multiplied. Men shook uncontrollably. Some refused to move. Others wandered aimlessly, detached from reality. Medical officers did what they could, but there was little time or space for treatment. The war pressed forward regardless. Orders demanded movement, defense, counterattack. Men complied because stopping meant death, and obedience at least gave direction. Christmas passed almost unnoticed. By December 26th, the forest showed no sign of mercy. Snow continued to fall. Temperatures remained brutal. The battle ground on, with no clear end in sight. The Ardennes had become a place where survival depended as much on endurance as on courage. For many soldiers, the memory of that Christmas would not center on combat, but on cold, on numb fingers that would never fully recover. On nights spent convinced sleep meant dying. On the silence of snow falling on the dead. The forest did not care who won. It simply took its share. By the time December 24th, 1944 turned into Christmas Day, the Ardennes no longer felt like part of Europe. It felt cut off from time itself. The front lines had dissolved into a patchwork of isolated positions. Barns, fortified with sandbags, foxholes carved into frozen earth, shattered villages held by handfuls of men who no longer knew where the larger battle stood. Orders filtered down slowly, if at all. Maps were guesses. Distances were lies. What mattered was what you could see in front of you, and often you could see very little. Snow continued to fall through the night. In the darkness, American and German soldiers occupied spaces that had once belonged to farmers, families, animals. Haylofts became observation posts. Kitchens became aid stations. Bedrooms became morgues. Religious icons watched silently as rifles leaned against walls and blood soaked into wooden floors. Christmas arrived without permission. In an abandoned farmhouse near Hansfeld, a group of American infantrymen huddled around a small stove, scavenged from a neighboring building. It barely worked. Smoke filled the room, stinging eyes and lungs, but no one complained. Warmth, any warmth, was worth the discomfort. Someone had saved a can of peaches from a ration pack. It was passed around with exaggerated ceremony, each man taking a spoonful before handing it on. The sweetness felt almost unreal after weeks of cold bread and tasteless meat. No one spoke of home. Talking about home made the distance unbearable. A chaplain arrived briefly, moving between positions as best he could. He offered a short prayer, barely audible over the wind outside. The men removed their helmets out of habit rather than faith. Some closed their eyes. Others watched the door, hands never straying far from their weapons. The prayer ended quickly. Christmas could not linger here. Across the forest, German soldiers marked the night in similar ways. In a barn outside Stavelot, an infantry squad lit a single candle, shielding it from drafts with cupped hands. Someone murmured a familiar hymn, then stopped when the sound carried too far. The candle was extinguished immediately. Silence returned. German rations were as meager as American ones. Coffee was often a memory. Food was eaten frozen or not at all. Men stamped their feet constantly to keep blood flowing. Frostbite took toes silently, sometimes without pain until it was too late. For both sides, the enemy was often abstract. Men fired at shadows. They aimed at muzzle flashes. They threw grenades into buildings without knowing who was inside. Combat became intimate and impersonal at the same time. Faces glimpsed for seconds, never seen again. Christmas did not change the rules. In foxholes along forest ridges, soldiers spent the night fighting sleep. The danger was well understood. Hypothermia did not strike dramatically. It persuaded. It whispered that rest was deserved, that eyes could close for just a moment. Men shook each other awake repeatedly, sometimes angrily, sometimes desperately. Don't sleep. Stay with me. Just a little longer. These were not commands. They were pleas. Those who fell asleep sometimes did not wake up. By morning, they were found stiff, bodies locked into the positions they had held through the night. Helmets rimmed with frost, rifles cradled in frozen hands, faces calm, almost peaceful. There were no ceremonies. The living moved on because they had to. Christmas morning dawned gray and indistinct. Snow softened the landscape, making destruction look deceptively gentle. Ruined villages appeared almost serene beneath white blankets. Smoke drifted lazily upward from burning buildings, blending into low clouds. Artillery resumed early. Shells crashed into woods, shattering trees, and sending splinters spinning through the air with lethal force. A tree burst apart could kill as effectively as a direct hit. Soldiers learned to fear forests during bombardment more than open ground. Medics worked continuously. Aid stations overflowed with wounded men wrapped in blankets, faces pale, lips blue. Limbs were amputated not only because of shrapnel, but because frostbite had destroyed tissue beyond saving. In some cases, fingers were removed simply to prevent gangrene. Painkillers ran out quickly. Men screamed. Men begged. Men went silent. Christmas hymns echoed faintly from distant villages, where civilians still dared to hold services. The sound carried through the forest in fragments, distorted and haunting. Some soldiers listened. Others cursed. A few cried without knowing why. The war did not pause. In several sectors, American and German units found themselves separated by only a few hundred meters, or less. At night, they could hear each other coughing, shifting, muttering. Sometimes, voices drifted through the darkness, indistinct and human. No one answered. There would be no truce. The memory of 1914, of soldiers meeting in no man's land, felt like a myth from another universe. In 1944, there was too much fear, too much hatred, too much at stake. Men shot first because hesitation could be fatal. Throughout Christmas Day, fighting flared unpredictably. Small patrols collided in the woods. Houses changed hands multiple times. Snipers claimed victims who never saw them. Artillery fire intensified whenever movement was detected. Casualties accumulated quietly. Bodies were dragged into corners, covered with blankets or snow. Identification tags were collected when possible. Names were recorded hastily, often incorrectly. Many would later be listed as missing, their remains unrecovered until spring. Christmas letters arrived late, carried by units that were already overrun. Some men received mail dated weeks earlier, written with optimism that now felt cruel. Families spoke of decorations, of meals prepared, of prayers for safety. Soldiers read these letters by candlelight or not at all. Some tore them up. Others memorized every word. As night fell again on December 25th, exhaustion settled over the forest. Men were beyond fear in some cases, operating on instinct, muscle memory, habit. Christmas had passed without acknowledgement, swallowed by cold and gunfire. What remained was endurance. The Ardennes did not care that it was a holiday. It did not care about uniforms, flags, or faith. It demanded heat, movement, attention, and punished those who failed to provide them. By the end of Christmas Day, thousands more were dead. Some had fallen in firefights. Some had frozen. Some had simply vanished into the woods. For those who survived, Christmas 1944 would never be remembered as a date on a calendar. It would be remembered as a place, a forest, a barn, a foxhole, cold enough to erase everything else. By the final days of December 1944, the Ardennes had crossed a threshold. The fighting was no longer governed solely by tactics or terrain. Something harder had taken hold, an understanding shared by men on both sides that capture might mean death, and mercy had become a liability. This did not happen all at once. It emerged from fear, exhaustion, and rumor, fueled by real events that spread through the forest faster than any official order. On the afternoon of December 17, 1944, near a crossroads outside the Belgian town of Malmedy, soldiers of the U.S. 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were moving through territory recently seized by German forces. They were lightly armed, not a frontline combat unit, and had little understanding of how rapidly the German advance was unfolding. They never had a chance to retreat. Elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, an armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, intercepted the column. The Americans were disarmed and gathered in a snow-covered field near the Bagnères crossroads. What happened next would become one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front. Without warning, German troops opened fire on the prisoners. Some men were killed instantly. Others fell wounded and attempted to feign death in the snow. Survivors later testified that SS soldiers walked among the bodies, firing point-blank shots into those who moved. A handful of Americans escaped by crawling away under fire, running into nearby woods, carrying the story with them. By the end of the day, 84 American prisoners were dead. The event would become known as the Malmedy Massacre. News of Malmedy spread quickly, faster than confirmed reports, faster than official briefings. Wounded survivors reached American lines within hours. Their accounts were fragmentary, breathless, horrifying. They spoke of surrender, of gunfire, of men shot where they stood. By December 18th, the story had spread across units fighting throughout the Ardennes. The effect was immediate and corrosive. For many American soldiers, Malmedy changed the rules of the war overnight. The fear of capture, which had always existed, hardened into something else. Surrender now carried the possibility of execution. Taking prisoners became dangerous. Guarding them meant slowing down, diverting manpower, risking ambush. The logic was brutal but simple. If the enemy would not take prisoners, why should you? German forces, particularly SS units, faced similar fears. As Allied resistance stiffened and air power returned after December 23rd, German soldiers increasingly found themselves cut off, low on ammunition, surrounded by hostile civilians and advancing American units. Stories circulated of captured Germans being shot in retaliation for Malmedy. Some were exaggerated. Others were real. In the chaos of forest fighting, accountability disappeared. Small unit engagements left no witnesses beyond the survivors. Patrols collided unexpectedly. Men were captured in moments of panic, rage, or exhaustion. Decisions were made in seconds, often irreversible. Some prisoners were taken, others were not. It is difficult to reconstruct the full scope of executions in the Ardennes. Records are incomplete. Testimonies conflict. Many incidents occurred in remote areas where no formal investigation was possible until months later, if at all. Snow covered evidence. Spring thaw destroyed what remained. What is clear is that Malmedy was not an isolated event. There were other killings, some involving SS units, others involving regular Wehrmacht forces, and some involving American troops acting out of fear or retaliation. The forest did not discriminate. In the village of Chinon, on January 1, 1945, American troops reportedly killed German prisoners in an apparent act of reprisal. Details remain contested, but the incident was known at the time. Senior American commanders were aware of it. Few consequences followed. The war had entered a phase where control was slipping. For soldiers in the Ardennes, these events reshaped behavior. Patrols moved with fingers tight on triggers. Men hesitated to surrender, even when wounded. White flags were distrusted. Hands raised could still conceal weapons. Hesitation could be fatal. Combat became faster, closer, more lethal. German assault troops used deception, infiltration, and sometimes American uniforms to sow confusion, most notably in Operation Greif, led by Otto Skorzeny, which deployed German soldiers fluent in English behind Allied lines. Though militarily limited, the psychological impact was enormous. American troops began stopping and interrogating anyone they encountered. Accents were scrutinized. Incorrect answers to casual questions could mean arrest, or worse. Paranoia spread. For prisoners who were taken, survival was uncertain. Captured Americans were marched east in freezing conditions, often without adequate clothing. Some were wounded. Food was scarce. Guards were exhausted and nervous. Anyone who fell behind risked being shot or abandoned. German prisoners faced similar treatment once Allied momentum returned. Long marches, inadequate shelter, minimal food. Revenge simmered beneath the surface. The Ardennes produced fewer prisoners proportionally than earlier campaigns. It was not because surrender did not occur. It was because surrender was no longer trusted. Christmas week intensified everything. The emotional contrast, the idea that this should have been a time of peace, deepened anger rather than softened it. Soldiers read letters from home, describing celebrations they could not imagine. Some learned that friends or family had died while they were trapped in the forest. Grief turned sharp. Men stopped talking about after the war. They focused on surviving the next hour. In this atmosphere, restraint became fragile. After the battle, investigations would be conducted. German officers involved in Malmedy were tried by U.S. military tribunals in 1946. Several were convicted. Some were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. The massacre became a symbol, often simplified, sometimes politicized, of SS brutality. Other incidents were quietly set aside. The Ardennes did not produce a clean moral ledger. It produced exhaustion, fear, and moments where human limits were exceeded. For those who fought there, Malmedy was not remembered as a courtroom case. It was remembered as a warning that surrender was no longer safe, a warning that the war could not be trusted to follow rules, a warning that survival might require becoming someone you did not recognize. By the time Christmas week ended, the Ardennes were no longer just a battlefield. They were a place where the idea of return to normal war, to restraint, to humanity, felt increasingly distant. The forest had taken that too. By the end of December 1944, the Ardennes had grown quiet in a way that unsettled everyone who noticed it. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of accumulation. Snow fell steadily, erasing tracks, softening craters, smoothing over the violence that had ripped through the forest only hours earlier. What had been chaos, explosions, shouting, gunfire, was now hidden beneath a white surface that looked almost untouched. Underneath it lay thousands of bodies. Some had fallen in the first days of the offensive, caught in ambushes or artillery fire. Others had died slowly, of wounds, exposure, exhaustion, long after the fighting passed them by. Many had not been found at all. The Ardennes did not give them back. For units still fighting, the dead became part of the landscape. Bodies lay beside roads, half buried by drifting snow. Others were frozen in place against trees, slumped in foxholes, sprawled across doorways they had tried to defend. Helmets filled with ice, faces stiff, eyes open or sealed shut by frost. In many cases, there was no time or strength to move them. The ground was frozen solid. Digging a grave could take hours, burning calories men no longer had. Under fire, burial was impossible. Units marked locations as best they could. A rifle stuck upright, a helmet placed on a branch, a crude note scratched into wood. Often, even that was not done. The snow would cover everything soon enough. The cold preserved the dead in unsettling ways. Unlike the muddy battlefields of autumn or the heat of summer, the Ardennes winter halted decay. Bodies remained intact for weeks, sometimes months. Blood froze dark against white snow. Wounds stayed visible. Expressions remained fixed, unsoftened by time. Patrols occasionally stumbled upon men who looked as though they were resting. Only closer inspection revealed the truth. Some soldiers froze so quickly that they never collapsed. They were found standing, leaning against trees, rifles still slung over shoulders. Others died seated, backs against walls, eyes closed as if asleep. For the living, these sights carved themselves into memory. As January progressed and the German offensive stalled, Allied forces began pushing back. Ground was retaken slowly, painfully. With each advance, more bodies were discovered. Many were unidentifiable. Dog tags were missing, removed by comrades or lost during combat. Papers had disintegrated or been destroyed by fire and moisture. Faces were damaged by shrapnel, animals, or weather. Entire units were listed as missing in action. Families at home received telegrams that offered no certainty, only absence. Weeks turned into months without news. Some hoped captivity explained the silence. Others understood what the Ardennes meant. The snow concealed more than individuals. In villages like Saint-Vith, Houffalize, and La Glaise, mass graves were dug hastily when fighting allowed. Civilians and soldiers alike were buried together, names often unknown. In other areas, bodies remained where they fell until spring. Local residents later recalled the smell when the thaw came. As temperatures rose in March and April 1945, the forest began to return what it had taken. Snow melted, ice broke, the ground softened, and everywhere the dead emerged. Farmers found bodies while clearing fields. Children discovered helmets and bones along paths. Rivers carried remains downstream. Woods revealed shallow graves where markers had long since vanished. The Ardennes became a place of discovery long after the battle ended. Recovery teams worked methodically. American graves registration units moved through the region, exhuming remains, recording locations, attempting identification. It was slow, grim work. Each body required documentation, personal effects cataloged, remains transported to temporary cemeteries. Many could not be identified. They were buried under markers that read simply, "Known unto God." German dead were often left longer. Some were reburied years later. Others were never found. Even decades after the war, hikers occasionally stumbled upon remains. Bone fragments, rusted weapons, remnants of uniforms. The forest did not forget easily. For survivors, the sight of the snow melting carried a particular dread. Men who had lived through the battle spoke of fearing spring more than winter. Winter hid what they had endured. Spring revealed it. With each uncovered body came memory. The Ardennes offensive officially ended in late January 1945, when Allied lines were restored and the German army retreated, broken beyond recovery. Strategically, the battle delayed Allied advances by weeks and cost Germany irreplaceable resources. Humanly, the cost was immeasurable. Approximately 75,000 American casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. German losses estimated between 80,000 and 100,000. Civilians killed in villages caught between fronts. Thousands missing, many never accounted for. And Christmas stood at the center of it all. For many veterans, the memory of Christmas 1944 was inseparable from the image of bodies under snow. Not moments of combat, but moments of realization. The understanding that death could be silent, that it could arrive without warning, that it could be hidden, waiting. Men returned home carrying frostbite scars, amputations, nightmares. Some could not tolerate cold again. Others could not tolerate silence. Snowfall became a trigger rather than a comfort. They did not speak easily about the Ardennes. When they did, they spoke of cold before they spoke of fear, of snow before they spoke of bullets. And always, somewhere in the story, Christmas appeared. Not as a holiday, but as a marker. The point where the war stopped pretending to be anything else. The Ardennes forest stands today as a place of remembrance. Trees have grown back. Villages rebuilt. Roads cleared. Tourists walk paths that once ran red and white with blood and snow. Cemeteries stand in ordered rows. Names carved into stone. Dates fixed in time. But beneath the soil, beneath the roots, beneath the silence, the forest still holds what it was given in December 1944. Bodies under the snow. Christmas is meant to interrupt violence. That is its promise. Ancient, symbolic, deeply human. A moment when killing pauses, when enemies hesitate, when the world remembers something older than war. History is full of stories that try to prove this promise true. The Ardennes do not belong to those stories. In December 1944, Christmas did not stop the fighting. It did not soften orders. It did not protect the wounded, the lost, or the captured. It simply arrived, quietly, indifferently, into a forest already soaked with fear, cold, and blood. That is why this Christmas was bloody. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered as a turning point. A desperate gamble by a collapsing Reich. A dramatic setback that the Allies ultimately overcame. A story of endurance, counterattack, and eventual victory. All of that is true. But it is not the whole truth. For the men who fought in the Ardennes, Christmas 1944 was not a chapter in a campaign. It was an environment, a condition, a test of how much the human body and mind could endure before breaking. The cold killed without warning. The forest erased certainty. The snow hid the dead. And the war stripped away assumptions that had survived years of fighting elsewhere. That surrender meant survival. That holidays mattered. That there were still lines that would not be crossed. Those assumptions froze and shattered in the Ardennes. The Malmedy massacre did not create brutality, but it accelerated it. It spread fear faster than any order ever could. It taught soldiers that rules were fragile and mercy was dangerous. From that moment on, the battle hardened into something colder, faster, and more final. The Ardennes became a place of no return, not geographically, but psychologically. Men entered the forest believing the war was nearly over. They left it knowing how wrong that belief had been. Some never left at all. Unlike famous Christmas truces of earlier wars, the Ardennes offered no shared humanity across lines. There was no singing between trenches, no meeting in no man's land, no exchange of gifts or glances of recognition. There was only suspicion. Voices in the dark were threats. Movement meant danger. Silence meant something was wrong. Christmas, instead of uniting, deepened the sense of isolation. It reminded soldiers of what they were missing: warmth, safety, family, while offering none of it in return. That contrast made everything sharper. Sharper grief, sharper anger, sharper resolve to survive at any cost. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1945, the Ardennes revealed what Christmas had concealed. Bodies, graves, places where men had died alone, unnoticed, unrecorded. The forest returned them slowly, reluctantly, as if even it struggled to acknowledge what it had witnessed. Families received answers too late. Some never received them at all. And for those who survived, the memory of that Christmas did not fade with time. It followed them home, into winters that felt too cold, into silences that felt too loud, into holidays that never felt the same again. The Ardennes were not unique in this. That same winter, Budapest endured its own bloody Christmas, encircled, starving, executing its own civilians by the river, while candles burned in windows above. Different geography, different victims, the same truth. Christmas does not protect those trapped inside war. It only exposes the lie that war can be paused when it becomes inconvenient to our conscience. That is why historians still return to December 1944. Not because it was the bloodiest battle of the war, not because it changed the outcome of history, but because it removed the last illusion. The illusion that there are sacred days. The illusion that symbols can restrain violence. The illusion that humanity survives automatically in extreme conditions. In the Ardennes, humanity had to be fought for, moment by moment, breath by breath. Some held on to it, some lost it. Some were buried beneath the snow before they could choose. This is why we remember it as a bloody Christmas. Not because it was a single massacre, not because of one order or one crime, but because Christmas came and the war did not care. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is the lesson the Ardennes left behind.